So what I want to do today is, like I said last time, we need to contrast Hobbes and more generally the modern position against the ancient position so that we sort of know how different it is. We can place it in context. And there's two ways that we do this through our readings. One is through that, what is political philosophy? And I asked you to get through the first part on the classical. And then the chapter by Burns in the Strauss-Cropsey Reader does that as well. And I gave you two handouts. The first one actually is Political Science 821. That's my graduate seminar, but I thought I'd use this handout in this class too to a certain extent and go through the first 6 points. So this is not going to be easy. I realize this. I'm going to kind of go slow. Ask me questions if you want to. And hopefully, though, if you really think about this and these points of contrast, it will help you with the whole rest of the course. So, and this is a document that you can go back to, and I would recommend going back to it. Like when we get to Locke, go back to it and just read it over again and think about how Locke fits into this contrast. The other thing that you have there is Hobbes versus the ancients, they're my notes off of the Hobbes chapter from the Strauss-Cropsey Reader. So Burns does the same thing, contrasting Hobbes in particular with ancient thought. And as you'll see when you get into Hobbes' Leviathan, this was a big deal for Hobbes because he saw himself in light of the ancient philosophers, particularly Aristotle, who was a really big deal for academics at that time and for centuries before. He was the father of philosophy for the Europeans. And so Hobbes was among the first to really openly challenge Aristotle, Aristotelian thought, and all of the scholastics, all of the academics who he thought worshipped Aristotle. Okay, so why don't we take a look at this one, the 821 one. And today I'm gonna do a little bit of lecturing, even though there's just 5 people here, because I think it's important to get this established. So basically what this is and what Strauss does in his article, which you've read half of approximately, is contrast the ancient with the modern, and the modern position. And these are pretty broad, big broad terms. And Strauss and everybody else knows that they're only so accurate, that you can find in modern political thought characteristically ancient positions, and you can find in ancient thought characteristically so-called modern positions. If you have, most of you have dealt with Plato's Gorgias because you took my Intro to Political Thought class. So you know that Gorgias, who was a rhetorician in ancient Athens, had some pretty, quote, modern positions. The powerful should prevail, self-interest is number one. It's all a matter of perspective. Nothing is true, everything is relative. Those are very modern positions. They sound more like Friedrich Nietzsche than they do like, Plato or Aristotle. So this is what I mean by when Strauss contrasts ancient with modern, he's talking in generalities, right? He's making big comparisons, but I'm sure he understands that there is in reality, no absolute contrast between the two. But there's an emphasis, a difference in emphasis. And in the modern world, there's a development of these so-called modern themes and a rejection, more and more a rejection of the ancient values and ancient positions. So if you turn your page, we'll take a look at 6 points. I won't go through all of this, but the first 6 points that Strauss makes, some of which you won't have covered yet because you won't have read the second part yet, right? But over the course of the time we spend on Hobbes, I'd like you to read that second part, at least up to where he talks about Hobbes, okay? He does move on into Nietzsche and what we would call postmodernism, but you don't need to go that far if you don't want to. All right, so first of all, Strauss points out the ancient philosophers viewed moral and political matters by contrast with humanity's perfection. What that means is that they thought of what human beings could become, what their best state was, what they were capable of, right, as their natural end or their natural goal. Right? Yes, they understood that people can become savages in civil wars, in all sorts of conflict can occur, but this is the decline of human beings, or the sort of the degradation of human beings, not who they really are, right? So the ancient philosophers insisted that we need to see human beings in light of their perfection, what they can become. And this is why Plato, for instance, speaks in the Gorgias of the true orator, right? Or in the Republic of the philosopher king, and of the rightly ordered soul and the rightly ordered city. This is the very best that human beings can achieve. For the moderns, the state of nature was the norm. And they did not think that people could surpass it. So modern philosophers viewed these things in contrast with mankind's origin, which they said was the state of nature. The state of nature is that state in which people are free to do and be whatever they want, right? So in Hobbes, the state of nature is when there's no government in charge. What will people do if there's no government in charge? Well, he said, what they will naturally do is start to kill each other, because there will be radical mistrust. Everybody will want the things and the power that are out there. Nobody will want to cooperate. And this is the way human beings really are. And we cannot really surpass this. All we can do is control it. We can keep each other from killing each other, basically. Now, I don't think that ancient philosophers would disagree that our origins are in conflict. I think they understood human beings are very prone to war, to corruption, to all kinds of abuses, but they didn't see it as useful to basically approve of those things, okay? And this was not the best that we could hope for. And if we tried hard enough, we could move beyond this state. But for Hobbes, this was the natural condition of human beings, and the best we could do is to figure out a way not to kill each other, okay? So, any questions about the first point of contrast? Okay. All right, let's take a look at the second. So Strauss then says, for the ancients, man is a political or social animal. Okay. When Aristotle used that phrase, man is a political animal, he meant social, right? He meant the type of being that wants to be with others, that wants to cooperate, right? Who can't really be fully human without cooperating with other people. Okay, that's what that means. We're naturally social. Okay? But for the modern philosophers, human beings are radically individualistic. Okay? We don't want and don't need other people to fulfill our nature. Now, we may need them in order to not starve in certain situations or to stay safe, but we don't need them to be the very best we can be, right? So, for the ancients, like Aristotle is who Strauss has in mind here, okay? Human beings, from the moment they're born, are born into a society. Their family is their first society. Actually, the first society is marriage, right? And then the children form, and you have the larger family. And then you have the extended family, and all of this is natural. Then you have the village, and then you have the city-state finally, right? The collection of villages. And it's only in the city-state, the highest political order, that people can really truly be completely human. They can fulfill, they can actualize themselves through political activity at that highest level by working with each other to make their experience in society the best it can be in political activity, right? And so Aristotle uses the term telos, or end. This is our natural end, is to be in this city-state, a very complex political order where we can be citizens, okay? So citizenship is natural. And it's partly an end in itself, meaning that citizenship isn't just so that we can be safe. It isn't just so we can keep our property. Actually, participating in the political process is a good thing in and of itself, okay? Very different from the modern approach that we see through Hobbes. As I said before, Hobbes sees the individual as the first and only reality, really. And society is an artificial creation of human beings to fulfill certain purposes, right? It has no good in itself. There's no need to be a full citizen in Hobbes's political thought. In fact, the more of a citizen you are, in the Aristotelian sense, participating in politics, the worse, because you're going to cause conflict. You're going to get too involved, and you're going to be too concerned about you don't really know what, right? And so Hobbes says, individuals should choose society or political order for very basic, specific reasons. The number one reason being safety. Okay? And for the sake of that very important reason, be willing to hand over all of their so-called rights, which they might have had in the state of nature, to a government, so that the government is powerful enough to control people and stop them from hurting each other. Okay? So that's a very different view of government. On the one hand, with the ancients, you have government as natural and good, and it gets people involved, and they can develop themselves through their political activity, and they can, as a community, define the good life and what justice is and all of these things, and shape the souls of the citizens, right? And in the modern approach, you have government as a sort of artificial imposition. It's a result of a contract. It's very specific. It's not particularly a good in itself. It serves a necessary purpose, a sort of unfortunate purpose that comes along with the fact that we're so prone to violence, basically. Okay? So now notice what that does with the modern position. Then where do we have to go if we want to figure out what the so-called good life is? For the ancients, they could go to government, right? The government defined what the good life is, whether it was the Athenians with their democratic citizenship or the Spartans with their warriors, okay? But if government isn't about making people better and making people true citizens, where do people go if they want guidance on how to be a good person? Where do we go? Because we live in this way.
I mean, you could say the church, right?
Yeah, that's a
or
big
sort of
way.
Religion.
Right, religion. And religion is private. Okay, now in the ancient, and we'll just extrapolate a little bit, the medieval position, right? In Europe, the church was the primary way in which people would strive to be good. They would go and they would learn about, morality and God's will and so forth. And the state supported that, and the state and the church worked hand in hand for all kinds of reasons, but the idea was it's part of the state's business to make sure that, people's souls are saved and that they're guided in the right way. For the moderns, religion is still there, but it becomes a private concern. And it becomes more and more something that you can take or leave. You can believe what you want. As time goes by, that's more and more the case. When we get to Locke, but even in Hobbes, it's not so much about what's true about religion as what is useful. And by the time we get to Locke, toleration is the theme. Yes, you can believe what you want within certain parameters. It's your business, right? So religion becomes a private concern but it is a place where you can go if you want to get that kind of guidance. Family, civic institutions of a variety of kinds, but they're all private institutions. And you as an individual are free to avail yourself of them if you want to. But the state less and less takes a position, right? Okay, so public versus private becomes a distinction here. Morality in the ancient view is a public concern. Morality from the modern position is a private concern, okay? And the reason for that switch is because, as you'll see with Hobbes, people were tired of how they were killing each other over religious and moral values. And there had to be in these people's minds another solution. So Hobbes basically said, we're going to take this off the table. Now, the way that he does it is different, right? And it's more complicated than Locke's. He does this by just simply saying, it really doesn't matter what type of Christianity people follow, although it did have to be Christianity. Doesn't really matter, but the sovereign's going to choose which one it is. And then everybody is going to at least outwardly conform to that. You can go home and believe whatever you want, but we're not going to see any conflict in public. So we'll have to cover that. It's a complex position that he takes. But in effect, he doesn't care about the content of it. It's just the fact that it's so conflictual. It causes problems, so we've got to do something with it. All right, so let's move on to the third. But first, any questions about that second point of contrast, public versus private? Okay. All right, so third, the ancient position, Strauss says, is that government should foster virtue. We've sort of implied that already. For the moderns, government should provide safety and liberty, at least when we get to Locke. Okay? So I guess the point of contrast that I can make here that's a little bit new is this, to focus in on virtue. Okay? The ancient position is that virtue is about justice and morality, moral goodness, okay? And the government's job is to foster that virtue, okay? We've already kind of made this point. But for the moderns, it becomes something completely different, okay? Again, for those of you who took my intro class, you remember Machiavelli used the term virtue, right? Virtu. And what did Machiavelli mean by virtue? Do you remember? Was it morality? Yeah, it was skill. He purposefully changed the meaning of the term to make a comment on the previous way. And he said, previously these philosophers tried to define, morality. They tried to define the ideal political order, and this just leads to nothing but trouble. It leads to our ruin, he said. And for that reason, he changed the definition of virtue, and virtue became political skill. Right? Political and military skill, without concern for morality. So notice what happens there. There's a deep skepticism about the very, meaning and value of old-fashioned virtue. Okay? For the idea that the more that we concentrate on morality as virtue, the more vulnerable we are. Maybe the more soft-headed we are as far as dealing with others, with our enemies. Okay? The more likely it is that we're going to fight with each other over it. For all of these reasons, it's an idea that the modern philosophers are very skeptical about. Okay? Hobbes has an interesting position on virtue and morality, and that is that it becomes whatever is defined by law. Okay? So whereas the ancients thought there was some truth, some definition, and they spent a lot of time trying to figure it out, using reason, try to figure out what is justice, what is virtue, right? For Hobbes, he says there's no way we can even possibly win that argument. We can't determine through reason what is justice or what is virtue, okay, or what is morality. Because people are going to constantly argue about it. It's a matter of perspective, right? So the best we can do is basically have a sovereign strong enough to sort of arbitrarily define it for us, right? Somebody has to define it, or else we're going to fight about it. So this sovereign will be strong enough to arbitrarily define it for us, and that's our law. So whatever is law is what is virtuous for us, okay? That's what we call legal positivism. So we have this contrast developed between the ancient position, which we might call natural law, the idea that there's natural justice, natural virtue, and it may not be reflected in any regime's particular laws. And we have this modern position developed that says virtue is whatever the political power says it is, right? So obviously that has its problems, right? But I'll tell you the reason why Hobbes thought it was important for the sovereign to define morality. Okay? Basically, he thought until we accepted that, individuals would be able to judge their government and would be able to say, it's not doing the right thing according to my view of morality. And if it's not, then I can work against it, and I can plot against it, and I can join a revolution, right? And fight it because it's not reflecting the right Christianity or the right, moral values. And all of that leads to civil breakdown and people die, right? So there has to be some way of stopping this. We have to all agree to basically obey the rather arbitrary definition of virtue given by the sovereign, okay? Locke, of course, comes up with a different and maybe arguably better way of toleration. Again, basically the government allowing freedom and a further privatization of these moral notions, of moral definitions and so forth. And as the notes say there, he also develops this idea of bourgeois virtues, which we will no doubt get into when we deal with Locke. All right. And this is an interesting point that Strauss makes. He says that in the fourth point, the ancients thought that the best regime, which was rule of philosophers, rule of the wise, could never exist in its perfection. That is, he understood that his republic, his ideal city, was just that. It was an ideal. You could arrive in your mind, but people could never live up to that level of perfection, right? But it was a standard that they could use by which to reform and come closer to that, okay? So there was a use for it, but he was realistic. And actually the ancients thought that history was cyclical, thought that you would have times when very wise people would rule, just because sometimes wise people emerge. Sometimes they emerge under pressure, when history calls for them, or sometimes just accidentally you get a particularly good ruler. And during those times, people are guided well. But at other times, you get terrible people in charge, and there's not much you can do to avoid this lack of wisdom. It's going to happen. Okay? So for that reason, we can only go so far in our efforts to achieve perfection. Now, for the modern philosophers, he said, the best regime is possible everywhere because the modern philosophers lower their standards and lower their goals, right? So Hobbes basically would say, look, we've tried for these perfect regimes in the ancients and also in the medieval Christian scene, and what do we get? We certainly haven't achieved anything like perfection, and we're constantly at war. So let's just focus on safety and security now, and assume that the leaders as well as the followers are self-interested individuals. If we do that, the government that we achieve actually can be lasting. So for the first time, well, really with Machiavelli you get a glimpse of this, but with Hobbes you definitely see it full blown. There's this idea that with the right political science, we can actually achieve a lasting regime, right? Something that will serve people's interests and will not crumble and fall apart, but will continue to operate because it's operating on something very solid, right? There's self-interest, fear, okay? Very solid foundations, very predictable foundations. So this became the new modern political science, right? And the new modern hope. And actually there's several points of flowering of this, but the Enlightenment thought is one, where you get these Enlightenment philosophers who think that human reason can devise an everlasting regime of enlightenment, where everybody's free and everybody can kind of be who they want to be. And of course we have the communist revolutions that actually kind of come out of the same stew with some different twists, and hope to completely break the cycle of history, when we actually come to a full worldwide communist solution to human problems. All right, so, we generally tend to think of the ancient idealists as utopian, but I hope that actually when you look at it in a different way, the modern thought can become utopian. There's such a belief in human reason, there's such a belief in self-interest. One thing that you'll see with Hobbes is, even though he says human beings are so full of violence in the state of nature, he places an incredible hope on people's rational self-interest, that they can actually agree on what their rational self-interest is and then have enough self-control to be able to follow through consistently on the social contract. That's an incredible demand on people, and it is one that they've been able to accomplish. At least not in the Hobbesian way. All right, so let's see. Fifth point. All right, so for the ancient philosophers, political philosophy must be combined with statesmanship to deal with contingencies. This kind of follows from the point before. There's always going to be that need for the wise, because no set of laws can really deal with all of the different needs of people. So there will always be a need for the wise to make decisions. The modern philosophers attempt to eliminate the need for statesmanship or wisdom in political rule. Okay? We'll find Hobbes basically saying it doesn't matter if the sovereign is a child or an imbecile or an old man, on his way out. It doesn't matter. What matters is the system. If people believe in the system and have bought into the system, they will and should obey whoever is in power. Okay? And he would argue that that is always going to be better than the alternative, which is civil war. Okay? He actually goes through, and we're not going to read all of this, but he goes through all the different scenarios. Let's say that the king dies early and the heir is 5 years old, okay? Which that type of stuff happens. So then what do you have? Well, you have a regent for a while, right? Somebody who rules in the child's stead, right? But as long as everybody cooperates with that system and sees the need for it, because the alternative is worse, okay, it will still work. You don't have to have the wise to rule. And in fact, you can have a monarch who's really rather tyrannical, and it will still be better for people than the alternative. Hobbes is famous for saying, one man's tyrant is another man's monarch. Okay? Tyranny is a matter of perspective anyway, right? And so a lot of his quest was just to get people to imagine what life would be like if they had to live on their own in total freedom in a state of nature. Okay? So if you have that perspective, then you don't need philosopher kings, you don't need popes, you don't need religious leaders, moral leaders. You don't need a leader who is wise. Okay? You just need somebody who's firmly in charge and who understands at least his self-interest in maintaining power. And Hobbes says if you have that, what you will find is most of the time, unless it's a child, in which case you better hope the regent is okay, what you will find is that monarchs understand that it's in their self-interest to not destroy their people, because where do they get their power and their money? They get it from their people, right? So they will normally see, and this is where the hope is a little bit too much in Hobbes. He says normally they will see that the more that they take care of their people, provide them with good laws, with the opportunity to make money, the better off the monarch will be, okay? Unless they're crazy or just not very bright or any number of things, some of which happened in European history, obviously. So some monarchs became so caught up in making sure that everybody worshipped the right way that they destroyed their kingdoms in the process, right? So it's far from obvious that Hobbes sounds very sophisticated, and other modern thinkers do too. Oh, self-interest is so rock solid, right? We can always count on it, except for when we can't, which is about half the time, unfortunately. All right. Finally, Strauss says the ancients thought the contemplative or philosophical life was the best life, whereas the moderns don't attempt to identify a best life and leave the value of philosophic life in doubt. That's partly the public-private distinction I made earlier, but that last part makes it even more, I guess there's more of a point there, in that the modern way of looking at politics tends to almost denigrate the intellectual life. In other words, intellectuals become problematic. If they are around, they're likely to be critical, they're likely to think too deeply about politics. They aren't necessarily useful to ruling. And so the philosophic or contemplative life, and also we might say the religious life, becomes more dubious as a result, okay? There's a suspicion and there's a shift in what we admire and what we pursue, right? So in the American regime, for instance, and Tocqueville observed this back in the 19th century, he said, the truly admirable human being in the American system is the moneymaker. Okay? It's the person who is a good citizen, but he's a good citizen because he knows the system. It's important to keep the system in place so that he can have a context in which to prosper, right? And the virtues that he develops are going to be the virtues of commerce, such as honesty, to the extent that he does honesty, hard work, cleanliness, even modesty, accommodation, those kinds of virtues. So this position is far from the position of admiring the intellectual or the artist, right? And Tocqueville said, that I can't hardly find any. Now, obviously, he's, hopefully he was wrong, but he was a Frenchman, coming over here, checking us out. He was an aristocrat, but he said, I can't hardly find any intellectuals, and when I do, nobody wants to listen to them. Where are the artists? Where are the writers of literature? Where are the playwrights? And you can find a few, but nobody pays them any attention, right? So, but from the modern perspective, that's great, because the more that people involve themselves in business, in making money, right, and start to value their comfort, their comfortable, living, the less they will be concerned about things that cause them to fight with each other, right? So there's almost this anti-intellectualism that develops, especially post-Enlightenment. There's this high point of the modern intellectual in the Enlightenment. But even within that, there's a strain of distrust. And after that, you have this growing anti-intellectualism. Because the intellectual's dangerous. If you haven't noticed, that's the way a lot of modern regimes look at, modern repressive regimes, they don't like intellectuals very much either, right? They have all sorts of ideas that challenge the regime. Okay? In America, they just become irrelevant in a way. People don't want their sons and daughters to become artists and authors, and priests and so forth. Okay. All right, so those are the 6. The document goes on, and go ahead and take a look at that if you want to. It deals with the rest of that Strauss chapter, but that's all I wanted to cover for today on that. Any questions about that contrast so far, or comments about the ancient versus the modern, generally, position on things? Okay, so, I think, of course, living in our society, we tend to not think in terms of what we could be, but we sort of accept the way that we are as the natural way. That's the way it always is, right? But one of the things that Strauss did for us with writings like this is to say, no, you are the product of a particular type of regime, more than you know, right? You tend to look at society and politics in this way, but this isn't the only way, right? But a lot of people in America would never even know that. And of course, our philosophy does tend to actually reinforce that notion. Because we are taught that individualism is natural, right? Because Hobbes and Locke and other people said it was. The American founders tended to think so, right? That individualism is natural, that there are these natural rights that individuals have and so forth, that everybody wants equality, right? But actually, as with everybody, we're more of a product of our regime than we can possibly imagine. And it's difficult to break out of that and to see ourselves and other liberal regimes in a more objective light. So this type of contrast does help with that, right? To be able to see, now maybe the way that we do things is actually good, or at least better than alternatives. However, if we sort of blindly accept what type of people we are, so to speak, then we don't know ourselves, right? And we can't understand both the strengths and weaknesses of the way of life that we happen to be immersed in. So this is partly why it's useful. Okay, I can talk a little bit about the other handout, Hobbes versus the ancients. Some of it is repetitive, so I'll just kind of go through here and see if I make out anything that... There's some useful quotes in here from the Hobbes chapter that I'm going to have you read for next week. So a good thing might be to, read this and go over it while you're reading that chapter. I think that'll help. Let's see. Yeah, number 2 is a contrast that sort of implied, but I don't think I made in the previous discussion. Ancient position tends to be that human beings are naturally rational, right? And the reason for this is because the thing that separates us from other animals is our speech. This is an Aristotelian argument, right? So what makes human beings different from other social animals, he says, the fact that we can speak and we can make abstractions and we can argue, right? And we can try to persuade. So this is why we are naturally political, okay? That's why. Other animals are social, you might say. They flock together, geese, sheep, bees. You see these creatures that obviously are social in that way, but they don't plan, and they don't, organize, and they don't change their minds and so forth, right? Hobbes actually takes that very argument on in Aristotle and says, no, it's not that. Human beings are different from the social animals because we alone will kill over an insult. Okay? We are the only animals that will kill another animal, another human being, over an insult, right? What?
That still distinguish us because that's a product of speech. So we wouldn't be killing.
Good point. That's true. That's true. Although I suppose he would say, well, that's speech, but not reason. You know, in other words, you know, when we insult each other, like he wrote a book called Behemoth about the English Civil War. He had some information about the different. Oh God, no, it wasn't Behemoth. What was it? Anyway, he wrote about the war between England and Scotland. I don't think it was Behemoth. And in it, he talks about how this one commander rolled up the flag in English waters, you know, and just basically said, take a look at this, I can do this. And invited a conflict in the process. You know. So the Englishmen are looking over, we've got to blast these guys out of the water, you know. Why? Because they put up the flag. It's not our flag. So, you know, he makes this look really silly. They're fighting over a flag. They're fighting over, here they could just go their separate ways, you know. But no, you know, so people die over that type of thing and do so all the time. So yes, it's speech, but it's totally irrational, you know. And but another irony of Hobbes's position is you have to use reason to get out of that situation. And I have always thought Hobbes didn't quite understand what he was, well, I hate to say it, he didn't quite understand that you might be asking too much of the type of people that he's describing. If people are so irrational and fearful and self-interested and really prideful, can you ask these same people to reason their way out of that situation? So, yeah, it's weird. He's partly a pre-Enlightenment thinker because he places such emphasis on the power of reason to overcome these things. But it really is it's a hope rather than a reality. Oh, let's see. Yeah, I've already made that point. Yeah, made number 4. Let's see. Oh, number 6. Otherwise, just look through this as you read on Hobbes. But the point number 6 in the Hobbes document says the ancients encouraged the, quote, magnanimous man. Okay, this is a figure that you don't find post-Christianity in the Christian world, right? But Aristotle came with this idea of magnanimity as a virtue. The magnanimous man was somebody who truly was talented and great, physically, in battle, as well as intellectually, all right, and as a citizen in politics. And these men, and I'm using that term specifically because it only applied to men in Aristotle's system, these men understood and were not ashamed at all of their greatness, nor did they feel the need to humble themselves or to sort of create some sort of artificial equality with the people around them. Instead, they felt that anything that they did for the community was a benefit to the community and a display of their natural greatness, right? And so the reason why they did the things that they did, lead the community, provide the community with donations, what we would call donations of festivities and so forth, was to display their greatness, because this is what was fitting for them to do, right? And other people would look at that as a natural thing. Oh, you know, Pericles is a great man, you know. And we wouldn't expect Pericles to do anything but the very best and to display his abilities in war, in sports, in politics, and so forth. So what motivated the magnanimous man was honor, okay? the desire for honor, and honor in the ancient world was the admiration of other people. And all of that came with it. The trappings, right? In battle, honor came from the stuff that you could possess and the women that you could take in battle, right? And all of these so-called prizes. And that people would admire this largesse, okay, that you accumulated because you were good enough to do so. In politics, it was, using your stature to basically run things, right? And again, people would look up to that, it's natural, If you can do it, you should do it. Now, with Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity really, but with the Christianity, with the emphasis on humility, and with the growth of Christianity in Europe, you get this rejection of the idea of magnanimity. It becomes the sin of arrogance and pride, okay? And so there's this emphasis on humility. And even though Hobbes is dubiously a Christian, okay, and thinks of Christianity as mainly a problem, he's thoroughly absorbed this change of, focus and this condemnation of magnanimity, okay? So for Hobbes, humility becomes a priority. People need to understand how vulnerable they are. And there's no difference in Hobbes' view between the so-called great and the lowly in how vulnerable they are. And there's no difference between the king and the people except the fact that the king has power and the people do not. Okay? It's not that he's great and naturally admirable or deserves any more honor than anybody else, but he happens to be in charge. Okay? And then he defines what's honorable, obviously, because he has the power. Right? There's no natural, heroic figure out there, right, that's better than anybody else. So you get this, not only this ethic of humility, but ethic of equality. Everybody's on an even playing field because everybody in the state of nature is completely vulnerable. And when we become arrogant and we think we're better than others, that's when we're likely to get killed. We're likely to cause conflict, okay? So that's a big difference, and Christianity has a lot to do with that shift. And even though, we're living in times now where, we're more and more secular, that basic Christian idea of humility and equality is huge. It's left such a large imprint on the way we think that we don't even understand where it comes from, And so we see that coming through in Hobbes. All right, we're out of time. I might come back to this just briefly on Monday, but get into Hobbes, and I'll see you Monday.
You said